Okay, so picture this: two armies, right on the verge of battle, shields glinting in the sun, dust everywhere. You'd think it'd be like total chaos, right?
Right.
But here's the thing, even way back then, there were rules to warfare. It wasn't just a free-for-all. And that's what we're diving into today, the surprising laws and customs that governed ancient combat.
Yeah, it's about understanding that order, those principles, even in the middle of all that chaos.
And get this, we're starting off with summaries of ancient combat laws from like all these different civilizations.
Oh, absolutely. The material we're looking at is incredible. Everything from these sacred truces to these like really detailed codes of conduct.
I know, and the really wild part is, this whole deep dive, it actually started with a conversation with an AI chatbot.
Wow.
Yeah. It's kind of mind-blowing, like this journey into the past sparked by something so modern.
I mean, it really shows you how technology can connect us to history in these like really unexpected ways.
Exactly. So let's unpack some of this, starting with something that really caught my eye, sacred truces. Imagine like a full-on ceasefire in the middle of a war, all because of a festival or a religious event.
Yeah, and these truces were about a lot more than just, piety. The Olympic truce, for example, wasn't just about honoring the gods. It was a huge social and political event. It let these rival Greek city-states say, hey, we're all Greek.
Right.
It was a way of demonstrating power, like, we're so strong we can even pause a war.
I never thought of it that way, how those truces were almost a show of force. And I'm guessing also a chance for everyone to, catch their breath a bit before going back to the fighting.
Oh, for sure. Pragmatism and spirituality, they often went hand in hand. And this wasn't just a Greek thing. A lot of cultures,
Mhm.
from the Mesopotamians to the Celts, they recognized these sacred periods of peace.
It really shows how important religion was in their worldview.
Absolutely, yeah.
And speaking of intertwined, let's talk about those rituals surrounding ancient combat. The single combat to resolve disputes, the warrior initiation rites, the oaths before battle.
Right, right.
It's almost like every battle was a spiritual test, too.
In a lot of ways, it was. Victory wasn't just about, military strength. It was also about divine favor.
Right, right.
These rituals were a way to kind of like call on that favor, to show your courage and piety to the gods.
Which makes those warrior codes, like the Chivalric Code or Bushido in Japan, even more interesting. I mean, we've all heard the romanticized versions, but what was their real purpose, I guess?
Well, even though they're often idealized, these codes had a very practical side too. They were about discipline, fostering this sense of honor even between enemies.
Wow.
And, sometimes they even had guidelines for protecting people who weren't fighting.
So it's like trying to create order out of this, like, inherent chaos of war.
Exactly.
Trying to define what it meant to be honorable in, life or death struggle.
Yeah, absolutely. And even within these broader codes, different cultures would emphasize different values.
Right.
Like take the concept of counting coup,
Right.
practiced by some Native American cultures. Touching an enemy in battle, that was a greater act of bravery than actually killing them.
That's right. It was about, like, skill and courage in the heat of the moment, not just winning by any means necessary.
Exactly. Different values, different ways of waging war. It shows that there was no one right way to fight in the ancient world. But while some rules aimed to, elevate conduct, others were much more practical.
And that takes us from, like, the battlefield to the negotiation table,
Yeah.
Because one of the things that really surprised me was this whole idea of ransoming captured nobles.
Right.
Just like they were worth more alive than dead.
Yeah, ransoms, they were a calculated risk for sure.
I mean, really?
Oh, yeah, captured noble. That was a bargaining chip, a way to, potentially make a lot of money, gain an advantage.
So it was almost like this morbid investment strategy, right?
Well, yeah, I guess you could see it that way. Capture a wealthy enemy, hold out for the highest bidder.
Talk about cold-blooded economics.
Yeah.
But it does, like, make you think about the morality of it all.
Oh, absolutely. It raises all sorts of questions about the value of human life, especially during a war. And it wasn't always just about the money either.
I know.
No, this practice, it played into this whole system of battlefield etiquette almost. Nobles, they were often seen as, well, more valuable alive, maybe as a way to preserve some kind of order within the aristocracy.
Even across enemy lines.
Yeah, even then.
Wow. What about treating the wounded? That just seems surprisingly humane for, such a brutal time.
It might seem counterintuitive, but treating the wounded, even if they were your enemy, it had a certain logic to it.
Okay.
For one thing, it encouraged your own soldiers to fight harder, knowing they wouldn't be left for dead if they were captured.
That makes sense.
It was a way to build morale.
So even compassion had a strategic role. It's like they were playing 4D chess or something.
Exactly. You have to understand, warfare then, it was this multifaceted thing. Even acts of mercy could have a deeper purpose.
Yeah.
And this strategic thinking, it applied to sieges as well, believe it or not.
You're telling me there was, like, siege etiquette? I always pictured those as, like, the worst kind of warfare.
And there were definitely established rules, customs surrounding sieges. It wasn't just about being polite, though.
Right.
Siege rules, like letting a city surrender under certain conditions, those could lead to quicker, less costly victories for everyone involved. A long siege, it could be a huge drain on resources for both sides.
So it was in everyone's best interest to just, end it quickly if possible. Makes sense, though. I'm sure those rules weren't always followed, especially when it came to, the spoils of war. Were there any rules when it came to looting and pillaging? Because I have a feeling our listeners are very curious about this part.
Yeah, looting, that was always a complicated issue. Even with rules, it was a point of contention a lot of the time.
Right.
Some societies, they tried to regulate how the spoils were divided, maybe favoring commanders or those who showed bravery in battle.
Right.
But the reality was often much more chaotic. The temptation to just grab what you could, it often won out.
Because greed and, like, opportunity, that's a dangerous combination. Even with rules, it's tough.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it breaches of conduct, things like excessive cruelty, looting sacred sites, targeting civilians, that was more likely to happen when the rules weren't clear, or during desperate times, or if the victors just wanted to make a statement.
It's a good reminder that even with all these laws of combat, the darker parts of human nature, they could still take over. It makes you appreciate the effort, though, even if it wasn't perfect, to bring some order to something naturally chaotic. And, that leads us to a pretty interesting question. Do any of these ancient principles, do they still have any relevance today? Have we managed to keep any of this combat etiquette in the modern world?
It's wild, right? To think that something like rules of engagement, something so important in modern warfare, might go all the way back to these ancient codes. It's a testament to wanting some kind of humane balance, even in the chaos of war. It's been a constant throughout history.
Absolutely. I mean, the rules of engagement with, trying to avoid civilian casualties and using appropriate force, it really echoes those codes we talked about, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's centuries of evolution, figuring out what's ethical in war as a global society.
And it's not even just about the fighting itself. It's
Yeah.
how we deal with our enemies, even before things escalate.
Right.
Which brings us to diplomatic community.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
amazing how that concept, something we just take for granted now,
Yeah.
goes back to those ancient traditions of safe passage.
Yeah, the envoys, the messengers. The idea was that communication, even between enemies, it's the best way to, prevent things from getting out of hand.
Yeah.
Without that, things fester. Misunderstandings turn into bigger problems. Diplomatic immunity, it's like the guarantee those lines stay open.
It really highlights how important diplomacy is. Finding peaceful solutions, even when everyone doesn't agree. It shows that we're capable of reason, of compromise, even with all that tension.
Right.
And speaking of striving for something better, we have to talk about the Geneva Conventions. I mean, that feels like such a huge step forward.
Oh, for sure.
Centuries of trying to make warfare less brutal.
Absolutely. The Geneva Conventions, 20th century, they're all about recognizing human dignity no matter what.
Right.
It dictates how you treat prisoners, how you protect civilians, care for the wounded. It doesn't matter what side they're on. And while it's not always followed, sadly, it shows what we should be aiming for. A more humane way of fighting, building on all those earlier attempts to make war a little less chaotic.
It's a good reminder that even in the worst of times, even with all the horrors of war, we can still try to be better. This might seem like a bit of a stretch, but I see a connection between those ancient warriors with their courage and resilience and something like the Paralympic Games today.
Interesting. That's an interesting parallel.
It's about overcoming challenges, right?
Yeah. It is. The contexts are totally different, but they both show that human spirit, that drive to overcome, the warrior facing down danger, the athlete pushing their limits.
It's a nice thought, I think, that human resilience, that drive, it connects us through time. So as we wrap up our deep dive here, what are some key things our listeners should take away?
Well, we've gone from these ancient battlefields to the modern world,
Wow.
looking at the rules and customs that have shaped how we fight. And yeah, the methods of war, they've changed a lot, swords and shields to cyber attacks. But the questions, those stay the same.
Right.
How do you balance what you need to do strategically with being ethical? How do we hold on to our humanity in the middle of all that conflict? Those are questions every generation has to deal with. And maybe by looking at the past, by seeing how they tried to create order out of chaos back then, we can find our own way.
It's been a fascinating journey, for sure. And to our listener, keep thinking about those questions.
Yeah.
Because these weren't just some abstract rules. They reflect what those cultures valued, what they believed. And that struggle to find a balance between who we want to be and the realities of war, that's something we're all still figuring out. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.